Welcome. My name is Yael Rein. I am AIPAC's Director of Venture Tech. We hope everyone out there is staying safe, and we're glad that you're able to join us for today's AIPAC's digital discussion with Michael Eisenberg and Bradley Tusk. The events of recent weeks underscore the necessity of nations coming together to solve the world's greatest challenges. And as the United States and Israel confront the coronavirus pandemic, we at AIPAC are working to ensure the two countries find new and creative ways to partner together. That is why we are proud to support legislation that will be increasing funding for enhanced medtech cooperation at this time. The program will fund joint U.S.-Israel research and development to advance the use of technology, personalized medicine, and data to combat the coronavirus. We're looking forward to playing an active role expanding the U.S.-Israel relationship into this critical emerging field. Today, though, we're lucky to hear from two prominent venture capitalists, Michael Eisenberg of Aleph and Bradley Tusk of Tusk Ventures, on their thoughts on the current climate and the important role Israeli technology is playing. Shortly, they'll be interviewed by my colleague, Justin Goldberg, and as always, we want to make you part of the discussion as well. We ask that you submit any questions that you have for Michael or Bradley throughout our call. You can do so by putting your questions into the chat box, either publicly or privately to me, or feel free to send an email to me directly at yrein@aipac.org. Quickly, before we begin, we want to get everyone involved right off the bat and take a poll of the room. Keeping with the theme of today's call, we want to ask you, what industry will benefit most from a deepening U.S.-Israel tech cooperation? So we're putting up the poll right now. And if anyone has any questions about the poll. Okay, so as people are putting in the poll, feel free to, put those questions in also into the chat box as our call continues. While we're weighing in, I'd like to remind everyone that this conversation is off the record and close to the press. Now let's get to the conversation right now. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Yael. So I just want to make sure we've got Bradley on, we've got Michael on.
Yep.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and welcome. How are you both?
Good. How you doing?
Can't complain. Michael?
Good. How are you?
All is well over here. And I guess we should start by saying Mazal Tov, breaking news that there seems to be a unity government in Israel. I know, Michael, this is something that we were talking about a little bit in the lead up to this call just last week. And, maybe we can get to that later on. So, for those of you that are joining us today, don't know you two, Bradley and Michael hosted a multi-part series focused on Israeli tech on Bradley's Firewall podcast late last year, which, by the way, I'd encourage everyone to listen to if you haven't yet done so. We'll get to the current climate and Israeli solutions in a little bit, but let's start on your investment strategies generally and what you find so appealing about Israeli tech startups.
Mike, why don't you kick it off since you're the Israeli VC on the call?
For me, it's my home base. So, but I moved to Israel 26 years ago, as you all hear from my accent. I'm not originally Israeli, to try to help create an economy of sorts. That was my passion, and create jobs. And it's home court. And I think most importantly, there are two things, or maybe three things going on now. One is the technology that Israel is so good at around machine learning, data science, et cetera, it has kind of come of age, stuff that comes to the 8200 unit, et cetera. I think the second thing going on, the world's got some big problems right now and big challenges, and Israelis tend not to shrink away from big challenges. And Bradley and I in his podcast discussed this notion of attacking regulated industries using technology. I mean, we've both spent a lot of time on that. He's the real expert on it. And we're seeing more and more of that. Some of these harder industries, whether it's digital health, financial services, insurance, et cetera. And I think the third thing is we're at a time in history where the ethical, spiritual value you put into tech and tech innovation really matters. I couldn't be prouder of the Israeli entrepreneurs who are doing what matters in the world. It's funny. Bradley sent me a note. I looked it up today, Bradley. I think it was March 12th or 13th, right at the early days of when COVID was becoming in America. And he said, "Hey, are you okay? I said, I've never been busier. You know, we got to gather the troops and see how we help solve this for the Israeli government. He said, I really love that. When Israel, when kind of times are tough, everyone kind of moves to attack and gets involved and gets together in order to do that. I think there's a lot of that right now.
Yeah, I would say that I have seen more ideas, new technologies, and just generally concern from the Israeli entrepreneurs that we work with and VCs than the American, even though obviously Israel it's a decent sized part of our portfolio, but still relatively small for an American venture capital fund. So the mentality there of people jumping into action to try to solve a problem is really unique. And I think in some ways indicative of what we like about Israeli entrepreneurs in general. A few things. One is if you're an Israeli company, you can't really succeed just by running a startup in Israel. You've got to go global, and usually the US is the next stop. And one of the things that I like a lot about a lot of Israeli entrepreneurs is, at least when it comes to US government and politics, they kind of know what they don't know, and they let us do our job. So Daniel Schreiber doesn't tell us how to get states to give them insurance licenses. Around Shearson tell us how to get states to, or cities to sign up to do data partnerships. They kind of appreciate that it's a world that they don't know as well. And so that really helps a lot. So that's number one. Number two is I really love the maturity of Israeli startups, the founders and the people there. I just think by definition, having gone through the military and living in an environment like Israel, there's a sense of perspective that you don't necessarily have in the US. Maybe this will all kind of puncture anyway now that we're in a recession, but there was, at least for the last couple of years in the Valley, this kind of bubble of entitlement and preciousness that I think made it hard to really want to invest in or work with entrepreneurs out there. And look, Israeli CEOs can be difficult too. I don't think anyone on this call would disagree with that. But people have perspective. They serve in the military. They live in a place where life and death is at issue every single day. And as a result, exactly what the valuation is going to be for their next startup, or how much attention they get in TechCrunch or everything else, isn't really quite as critical to them. And it doesn't mean that you try to achieve anything less. It just means that they're a little mature in how they go about it. And the third is there's a network there that we really like. Michael and I met pretty early on into our first fund, and I think he grasped what we were doing and how we could kind of fit into his work. And we've fit into that network pretty seamlessly, and really have been able to meet and work with a lot of different companies. When Michael and I did our podcast last year, it was great that lots of companies knew about us and really wanted to come on and talk to us about what they were working on. And so there's a certain maturity and perspective that I think is unique among Israeli entrepreneurs that we really like investing in.
How are you both finding the climate right now from the investor perspective?
I go. So we have look. So we've only done one deal that we've funded, two deals. One new deal that we funded in the last, say, 6 weeks, and one extension of a Series A, where we basically just wanted to put some more money into the company at the Series A valuation. So I don't know that we have seen yet a lot of data to suggest where things are going, at least from a valuation standpoint. And like Michael, we're early stage investors, so in some ways, the goal for us is to find the really big winners. And ultimately, if the Series A valuation is a few $1 million higher or lower, it shouldn't really matter all that much. Either you succeeded and you made a lot of money, or you failed and you didn't. And it's not really about timing the markets or being super price sensitive. So to us right now, it's a few things. One is helping our portfolio companies navigate and survive this crisis. We have some that are really well positioned. We've made a bunch of telemedicine investments right before the pandemic, and those have obviously all been pretty good. We had some D2C investments where, now that people can't go shopping in stores, obviously those products are doing really well. But like everyone, we also have some prop tech investments, or even only one travel investment, thank God, but those are basically going to zero. But it's everyone who's at least not going to zero, helping them navigate this, make sure they have the resources, make sure they have enough cash to last. So it's a lot of portfolio management. And then also for us right now, because almost every company either wants something from government or fears something from government, our deal flow is higher than it's ever been. So we're just seeing a lot of stuff. I think we're not eager to deploy too much capital till we see where things shake out of valuations. But overall, if right now we saw something we loved, we wouldn't hesitate to do the deal.
Michael, same question.
Well, this is like my third or fourth cycle, depending on how you count them. So having been through 2008, I can say one thing for sure, and that is this is just the beginning. So drawing any conclusions 1 month into this, or 3 months if you're counting Chinese time. Actually, I think Chinese time is only half, so it's maybe a month and a half there. They count everything in halves, but it's just early. Who knows? You know, we invest through cycles. When you're an early stage investor, you shouldn't be following the market. And I try not to be influenced by the market. I try not to read newspapers. It's not healthy. And so, you know, we've brought in a bunch of companies to look at. I think we're about to pull the trigger on one. But it's that part of it's business as usual. And to Bradley's point, you know, some companies, we have one in the travel space. We have two companies actually that raised money probably 60 days before the brunt of the pandemic started to hit. And in both cases, the revenue went close to zero right afterwards. We got plenty of dough. So we'll see if it comes back. You know, but all in all, we've also been pretty well positioned in this. But, you know, it's so early. We're like a month into this, and we're not even. And it's, you know, no companies almost have reported earnings. And most of them can't assess what's going on. And so, you know, who knows?
What kind of advice are you giving your portfolio companies right now?
So on March 4th, from the back seat of a taxi in New York City, when I was changing my flight to get back to Israel, which turned out to be 2 weeks earlier than I needed to, I penned a letter to my portfolio companies that said 5 or 6 things. One of which is, this is going to take longer than anybody thinks, because they always do. That's one. 2, cash is king. Have 24 months of cash, basically on the assumption that your revenue is going to zero. And then 3, you want to be super aggressive and contrarian to take opportunities when your competitors are floundering. And you just try to suss out who's got a chance to take market share during this time versus who needs to kind of hunker down. But the first thing you do is hunker down. Somebody says, I forget who it is, those who are paranoid early, play later. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, so I would agree with everything Michael just said, and I think we've given similar advice. And that the only distinction for us is because our fund is specifically focused at the intersection of regulation and technology. I actually think, and this is the one point I really wanted to communicate today in this call more than anything else, that there's actually a tremendous amount of opportunity right now for startups from a regulatory perspective. Over the last few years, you've seen the balance of power in the U.S. specifically, although it's really almost equally true in Europe for sure. You've seen the balance of power shift away from business and kind of towards the left, whether it's labor or kind of progressives like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. And to me, the height of all of it was when Amazon wanted to create 25,000 jobs in New York City. We managed to say no and kick them out, which of course right now everyone desperately wishes we would have had those jobs back. And so when times are really good, voters have the luxury of saying, I'm going to focus on antitrust issues or privacy issues or things that go beyond putting food on the table and paying the rent. And when times are good, politicians have the luxury of saying, things are okay, so I'm just going to play to the base and I'm not going to worry about the broader good because all I really do is keep scoring points for people who vote in my primaries. Times are now obviously not good at all, and the perspective flips completely. So, you know, if you think about it, Bernie Sanders' candidacy, in my view, effectively ended the day that people start taking the coronavirus seriously. And a lot of that push from the left no longer really exists in the way that it did just 6 to 8 weeks ago. And look, Iowa was only a little over 2 months ago. And so you have cities and states now in the U.S. that are ravaged by terrible budget deficits, are seeing huge increase in costs, huge decreases in revenue, population declines, and they desperately need money, they desperately need help. So if you are an investor in a company that can generate revenue for government, this is a tremendous time to be in business. So for example, we're investors in a startup called FanDuel. It's a sports betting company. Mobile sports betting is legal in some states, but not in most. Right now, there's nothing to bet on because there's no sports, but I'm actually really bullish on our FanDuel investment because when it comes back, I suspect we'll quickly be able to legalize it in all 50 or call it roughly 46, 47 states, simply because they're desperately going to need the revenue. Or we don't really have any cannabis investments out of the fund. But if you were in the cannabis space, I think recreational cannabis will legalize a lot faster than it had to date, simply because people need the revenue. I think one thing, if you're watching this call and you want to know how politicians are going to behave, is just whatever the least hard political choice is, that's what politicians are going to make. So when times are good, they can spread money around and be Santa Claus and it's very happy. But when times are bad, and they've got to look at, am I cutting funding for these hospitals or schools? Am I raising taxes on people who are already struggling? Or maybe cannabis isn't so bad after all. Maybe sports betting isn't so bad after all. The isn't so bad after all crowd is going to start to win out a lot. So if you have revenue, you have a lot of opportunity. If you have the ability to generate real savings for government, I think you have a lot of opportunity. And quite frankly, if you employ a lot of people in a jurisdiction and you needed something from them before that you couldn't get, whether it was permits, licensing, zoning, you have a lot more leverage now to go up to them and say, listen, you want me to stay, you want to keep these jobs, here's what I need. So while overall what's happening is horrific, the balance of power on the regulatory side has shifted a little bit.
So I want to get back to that, specifically the role that Israeli technology can play here in the United States, from whether it's putting people to work, putting constituencies to work, or really helping alleviate problems just a little bit. But I want to stick this topic of regulation, or I guess deregulation, because obviously you're an expert on that. But I want to hear Michael's take on it also, because I know Michael invests in a lot of heavily regulated consumer industries as well. Do you see deregulation as the new normal, or just a temporary solution? Right now, obviously, we're seeing, especially in the field of telehealth and digital healthcare, the relaxing of certain standards. Where do you see, kind of looking into your crystal ball? I know famous last words, but what do you see going forward?
So one is, I'm going to leave anything having to do with regulation to Bradley. He's much smarter than I am. That's the first thing.
Just about
the second thing is I think the word that I focus on is digitization, which is one of the things that regulatory capture leads to is sclerotic analog processes. A funny story from literally yesterday. I've been working on a reboot plan for the Israeli economy post-corona, and one of the issues is obviously transportation. And somebody gets on his call who's an expert in transportation and says, there's some old guy in the Ministry of Transportation who still plans the bus routes with a pencil. And I thought he was joking, but apparently he wasn't. And I know, for example, that the New York City traffic lights, and Bradley knows this too, are also not digitized. And I think all this stuff, one of the things we've discovered through Corona, but it was true before, it just wasn't as exposed, is we have a dearth of data, a dearth of digital solutions. And we are now going to build all the tools that we built for Amazon to run their business. We're now going to build for all the old industries in the United States and for all the governments. So whether it's digital insurance or digital health or digital payments or digital traffic lights or digital planning for bus routes, we're going to build all that. And we'll start to make a trade with the people where if you're going to share some data, we're going to make your lives a lot easier. And we'll get the privacy stuff sorted out, et cetera. But that's the big trend in my view, is everything is going digital, everything. And the government is either going to get digital or it's going to get overrun by it, is kind of what I think is going on.
Yeah, you never really go backwards on convenience. So a lot of people who hadn't tried telemedicine before are now using it, and they're saying, hey, this is a lot easier and better than going to the doctor, right? I mean, if you think about, like, even way back in the beginning with Uber, why we were able to beat taxi is we gave people just a better, more convenient way to do something, and they were willing to demand it, and that legalized it. So I think whether it's, like Michael said, anything digitized effectively ends up in that place. Some will move really fast. Like we have seen just in states and at the federal government in the last 4 to 6 weeks, a lot of loosening of telemedicine regulations. So I think that will move really quickly. I think you're going to see it across the board. Look, religious institutions right now who are able to do their services online are reporting 300% increases in attendance. Now, maybe in tough times, people feel a little more, they want to be a little more attached to God and to religion. But overall, it's also an easier way to do things. So look, a lot of business travel is going to get replaced by Zoom. People realize, you know what, this was just fine. I don't need to get on an airplane. And so certain behaviors are going to set in for good. And I think that regulators, by and large, in looking at this set, don't have that much to worry about in some ways, because if you take, like, for example, all the micromobility stuff that drives regulators crazy, right? That's very physical, right? You have scooters and e-bikes and cars and everything else all over the place. So it makes a transportation planner's, worst nightmare. But if you're just talking about things existing in the ether digitally, there's a lot less for the government to usually worry about. So I think you'll see less of it. And I think you'll also see a boon for new ideas. So for example, Michael's got a company's portfolio called Healthy.io, which is at-home testing for UTIs and other types of infections. I think generally the at-home testing market is now poised to grow exponentially. And whoever I think can figure out how to make lab testing that where they get the results and can test them, if Healthy.io is immediate, but if it doesn't need to be immediate, is going to do really well also. So not only are you going to see these industries that Michael mentioned kind of digitize and be legalized, but then offshoot industries are going to come from them too.
We were joking around in the portfolio that everyone's parents and grandparents are now doing digital payments in Israel. And that wasn't true 8 weeks ago. So if 100% of the markets move to digital, including the hard to break through older demographic, you got to bet nobody's going back to see a branch manager anymore. That's done. And I've been on the phone with some of the CEOs of banks in Israel. This is over. Just over.
By the way, my mother just asked me how to set up a Venmo account. So if that's happening, then I can assure you. Her too?
Yeah, not Venmo, Bit in Israel, but anyway.
Well, I want to get to that in consumer habits in just a second, but I want to stick to this in terms of roadblocks and barriers and disruptive technology and kind of where things are going. Which do you see as more resistant to change? Do you see industry or government as the bigger barrier?
Well, it depends how you look at it. So typically the answer is government, and obviously regulation always lags innovation. But industry is a very broad term, right? So tech startups love it. And that's why people like Michael and I do what we do, is because we love to fuel this kind of disruption and try to, both make industries better, but also take out, old stodgy incumbents, because it's kind of fun to do that. So I think on the world that we're in, and if anyone chose to spend the time on this call, they're clearly interested in that world too, clearly industry, but you're going to have like the banks that Michael just said, where he said it's over. Yes, but they're not going to go down without a fight. They're not looking to give up their paychecks. And so they're going to try to use all kinds of, regulatory tricks and legal tricks and everything else they can to stick around and stay in business. So, some of industry very much will embrace this and do well with it. And the people who can see that, I think, can do really well as a result. But you'll see a lot of entrenched interest in incumbents, do whatever they can to hang on and stop progress.
The reason I was chuckling at the beginning is kind of exactly what Bradley said, is that there's typically we think of this as kind of government and industry. It's actually not like that. There are some industries that are dependent on government that's dependent on industries, and that's an axis. And it's that group of companies that has a hard time adjusting. People who through that alliance get to maintain a status quo that's being overrun by digital. But I think the other side of this issue is, and this is kind of an Israel-U.S. call, is you're starting to see companies, and it's true, China is true of Israel, it's true of U.S. companies also, cross borders a lot more easily. One of the things of digitalization is when you reduce friction, it's easy to cross borders. So Lemonade, with both Bradley and I are involved, in insurance companies started in Tel Aviv and New York simultaneously, is the only P&C insurer I'm aware of that operates both in the U.S. and in Europe simultaneously, because it's digital. And we launched in Germany. We launched in New York first, then I think we're in live in 27 states in the U.S., licensed in some 40, thanks to Bradley. And we launched Germany, I think, about a year ago. And we launched the Netherlands last week, and it's off to a super fast start. In the old days, first of all, if you were a U.S. insurance company, you couldn't launch in the Netherlands. But second of all, if you did, it'd take you, years to get, the licenses, the brokers with the license. It'd be a pain in the neck. You wouldn't do it. But with digital, they're up and running and moving really, really fast there. And so I think that's a big difference too. This kind of cross-border nature of innovation, disruption, and then marketing.
So in terms of, sticking on the theme of consumer habits, and, obviously it sounds like you're digital. Some of the lessons we learned coming out of the global financial crisis of, '08, '09, you saw a trend towards a much more sharing economy.
None. We're still printing money. None. We learned nothing. We continue to print money.
So some of the environment, the way that changed was how we went more towards a sharing economy. Do you see that changing coming out of this crisis, where people are, kind of forced to be relegated to their homes? And I guess, how do you see that impacting your strategy going forward?
It's a really good question, because look, people join the sharing economy for one of two reasons. Either they need flexibility or they can't find full-time work. And sometimes, by the way, they effectively do work full-time, but in a sharing economy role. Again, in the vein of when times are good, people have the luxury to think about issues other than putting food on the table. You saw California last year pass something called AB5, which effectively reclassified everyone in the sharing economy from independent contractors to full-time employees. And there was a lot of expectation by organized labor across the US that was the beginning of a movement that we would now see in what they thought was literally in April, May of 2020, 10 more states do this. Obviously, the world just changed dramatically. I think that you've got 2 or 3 states, New York, New Jersey, maybe Illinois, working on it. And my guess is either nothing happens, nothing particularly difficult for the sharing economy companies happens in any of those states this year. And so I think from a regulatory standpoint, we're more or less going to go back to where we were in 2018, 2019 on this issue, unless all of a sudden the economy miraculously recovers and everyone forgets this whole thing just happened. But then that's regulatory. But then the question is, from an economic standpoint, what will people want to do? In a time where there's less jobs, I think that if they're going to take whatever work they can get, and there may be less opportunities, an Uber driver or a Lyft driver or a handy professional or wherever else. But I don't think they're going to refuse to join the platform just because AOC said it's evil. And so, and I think people are going to still want stuff on. I mean, people don't care if their Uber driver is an employee or a contractor. They just want something as quickly and inexpensively as possible, right? So as long as the companies and the platforms can provide that kind of service and access, there's still going to be consumer demand for it one way or another. So, if anything, probably the last 6 weeks, at least from a regulatory standpoint, have been helpful to the sharing economy in the U.S.
So I was only half joking about what I said before about we haven't learned anything because we keep printing money. But I think we had this notion called the sharing economy, and it was a nice label, but it wasn't actually anything different than the previous economy. We found a new, frictionless, better way to provide transportation. It was called Uber. I got asked on a panel probably 6 months ago, before we did only Zoom panels. There were 600 or 700 people in a room and a bunch of regulators in Israel. And they asked me, what do I think the future of insurtech is in 10 years, and then what the future of fintech is? And I said, there's no such thing. These are just banks and insurance companies, but they operate fundamentally different. And they're built on digital substrates, and they have digital interfaces, and they're able to kind of seamlessly aggregate consumers in a way like Uber did. Uber is a transportation company fundamentally, but it's got a seamless way of providing a great customer experience. So that's what they do. And so I don't think anything's changed, by the way. This just accelerates trends that are already happening. And this will be a massive acceleration of a lot of these digitization trends that are underway.
So I want to come back to a theme that you both mentioned early on, which speaks to how the Israeli psyche and how they can respond to specific challenges that's happening right now in this environment. I kind of want to dig a little deeper on that. How are you seeing Israeli startups adapting, and how do you see the Israeli tech ecosystem emerge relative to other parts of the world?
So I'll tackle that first, but I'll, with your permission, I'll tackle it from 2 things that I think are absolutely unbelievably inspiring. I'm wearing a T-shirt of an organization. I don't know if you can see it, called Lev Echad, One Heart. It's an organization that exists only for emergency times, like when there were rockets in the south and during the pandemic. And we have 16,000 volunteers who pop up in a tech system that runs them, bringing food to people who are in quarantine, doing shopping for people, getting groceries, getting medicines. You know, it's not just gophers. It'll take care of you, be with older people, etc. Another organization I'm involved called the Shomer HaChadash has brought 20,000 people to pick the crops. You may have seen in the U.S. newspapers, there's a real problem across the world right now, France, the U.K., the U.S., picking crops. There just aren't enough workers for it. And people have literally volunteered, either unemployed or employed, to get out and do this. And I think there's a spirit here of how do we solve this together? What do I volunteer and what do I go do during this time? And the same thing's happened in the tech community. So when the government was having a hard time getting masks and gowns here, a bunch of entrepreneurs of mine got together and procured masks from China and Turkey. And people are building things and hacking ventilators and you name it. And our guys at Nexar with Bradley and I are both invested, took 3 days off from work to build an application to track COVID patients and see what they need. And I just think that's amazing. I think what's going to come out of this is a bigger esprit de corps. It's cut across even competitors, and a desire to tackle some of the biggest challenges the world has to offer right now. And there's still a scant number of innovation ecosystems in the world. There's Silicon Valley, there's New York, there's Tel Aviv, you know, there's Shanghai, maybe a couple of smaller ones, but you know, that's it. And so I think those, as digital becomes more important, those are going to, you know, expand more.
And what's interesting to me is that when I look at the Israeli companies in our portfolio, I have spoken to a lot of them specifically around COVID, but in some ways less around their own company's response to it. You know, Lemonade doesn't need my advice on managing cash, stuff like that. But what's amazing is instead I'm hearing from them on how they can help, you know, independent of what their startup actually does, right? So Michael mentioned the people who are picking at farms, and he brought us into that, and I think we're started working on that with them today as well. Or Daniel brought me a guy who created a 3D printed ventilator that could work in certain circumstances. It'll be a lot easier and cheaper than full ventilators, and we were able to connect them with the governors of Texas and New Jersey to help them provide them for their constituents. And all around, you know, an app where people can know who else around them has tested positive or has the antibodies. I saw that first come out of Israel before anything else, the tracking software that Nexar did. And so it's not just that I think Israeli companies are used to dealing in times of crisis. It's that their mind works a little differently, in which it was, how do we solve the problem? And then second, you know, how do we capitalize on it? And I'm sure that will come, and it should come. As investors, we want that to come. But the first and foremost has been very different. And I think that's why the response that I've seen, and by the way, I've seen really good responses from some of our portfolio companies in the US too, but it's not as cultural. It's much more just dependent on the individuals, right? So like Roman, which is a telemedicine company we're invested in, they've been doing a ton around this, but you have a CEO there who's a very, very public spirited person. But other companies, I think, have just sort of tried to focus on managing their own company, and that's fine. As an investor, I want them managing it. But yeah, just a different mindset and mentality from Israeli companies that you have to believe ultimately produces the greatest amount of innovation and the greatest amount of good.
So I'd like to stick with that theme for a second, just in terms of how Israeli technology is making a tremendous impact. Yes, globally, of course, but I want to focus on the United States. You know, historically, the relationship was predicated on security and defense cooperation. You know, generally speaking, how the U.S. can keep Israel safe and secure in a very hostile environment. As Israel's emerged, you know, to be a global tech leader, the relationship has altered significantly. And Yael mentioned that at the top of the call, some of the legislation that we're working on right now to enhance and increase funding for cooperative efforts in medtech as the U.S. and Israel tackle COVID together. And you're seeing how it's become a much greater of a two-way street. Which sectors are you seeing Israeli tech play a pivotal role here for the United States going forward?
So one that comes to mind for me that we haven't talked on this call yet is robotics. And it's a field that Israel has really made a tremendous amount of progress in. And there are certain physical activities that I think people are now going to want to replace with robots if they can. I'll give an example. We didn't invest in them, but we did a little work with a company in Israel called Skyline Robotics that has a automated window washing service. And, generally speaking, it seems to make sense that replacing people with robotics for really big buildings is safer and smarter. But now going forward, also, people are going to want to have, I think, less human contact in certain ways. Because, look, it seems to me that maybe tomorrow someone announces that they got the vaccine and we get out of this thing in a few months. But there's a good chance that we're dealing with aspects of coronavirus for a couple of years. And there's an even better chance that we're entering into an age of pandemics where we're dealing with other crises like this over the next 10, 20, 30 years, both because some of this can be recreated in a lab, so there's the risk of bioterrorism, and because we're so interconnected as a society that when something does happen, the risk of spread is just so much greater than it's been, which means that one of the natural human impulses, just in the same way that Michael talked about digitization, is going to be how do we replace some physical labor with machine labor instead? And you really see Israeli companies leading the way on much of that.
It's interesting. Bradley mentioned robotics. I agree with that. We got one very large investment in robotics that has done this since the beginning of this whole thing. I think I go back to what I said earlier, which is digital information flow is going to matter a lot, and figuring out who is your network of friends and who are your network of foes as all this digital information flows is going to be super important. Just to use a stupid example, but I think one that's highly pertinent right now is people are going to need, like they got a passport, they're going to need a health passport probably going forward. And global entry is not just going to have a fingerprint. And this is not going to work if we don't get governments cooperating on this. But sharing health information is sensitive. And so we're gonna have to figure this out on a network basis in some way. Those who can figure it out together, I think, are gonna have a big advantage as travel and tourism comes back. If it's easier for me to go fly into New York than it is to fly into the UK because of shared digital health information, that's gonna matter a lot.
So you bring up something that I want to touch on, and Bradley, let's go to you on this. What are some of the things that can be done governmentally to foster even greater cooperation from a tech perspective between the U.S. and Israel? What are some of the things that both the federal government can do, but maybe even state and local governments can do to enhance their relationship as well? I'm thinking the New York City Cyber Center is just one example.
Yeah, look, on the federal level, obviously, military cooperation is a huge piece of it. The greatest takeaway that I had from when Michael and I did those 8 podcasts over like 3 days, like a really intense couple of days, was is when the Israeli military chooses to engage with a sector of new technology, the benefits are obviously tremendous. And it doesn't always mean that they're developing a military technology per se. I mean, it's just something the military might find useful one way or another. The U.S., look, we have DARPA, and DoD certainly does fund a lot of different technologies, but we don't really do it in the same calculated way that the Israeli military does it. So clearly, I think, we could learn from them on doing a lot of that. From a state and regulatory standpoint, look, right now, especially when U.S. cities and states are going to want any new jobs possible to be created, there are Israeli companies that can set up shop in their cities and states and create jobs. It is in their interest to say, let us pave the way for you from a regulatory standpoint and make it easy for you to come here, right? And I think there's benefit if U.S. cities and states are smart enough to do that. There are places like New York that have an appreciation for Israel, have groups like AIPAC and people like Yael and Justin who work on this every day and can push the right policymakers in the right direction. But yeah, I mean, if we're smart, we're looking at the things like digitization, like at-home testing, like robotics, that are clearly going to be needed in an age of pandemics, and reaching out proactively to Israeli startups and saying, what will it take to bring you over here?
I think innovation economy is going to be generating a lot of jobs going forward. And if I'm a governor of a state in the U.S., I got 2 choices. I could try to persuade entrepreneurs in San Francisco, the Bay Area, and New York to come to my state, or I could try to persuade Israeli entrepreneurs to set up the U.S. presence in my state. I think if you got a direct flight, like from Miami or Chicago, which is going to have soon, you're probably advantaged in that way. But those are real ways to generate jobs and, and outside capital to your state.
Of course, we've seen for the longest time Israeli startups explode in the Bay Area. We've been seeing it over the last number of years in New York as well. Hopefully, that trend will continue. The last question I want to get to, and before I do, before we get to Yael, who's going to open it up to audience Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type it in the chat box or send it to Yael in direct message. But Michael, specifically for you, what have you seen the Israeli government do, kind of flipping the last, kind of topic on its head, so to speak? What have they done specifically to foster this kind of growth in the tech sector? And what have entrepreneurs done right to, I don't want to use the word exploit because it's got a negative connotation, but to I guess, take advantage of that?
Ironically, I actually think it goes back to one decision in 1991. When the Israeli government set up the Yozma program to create venture capital funds in Israel, they brought about $120 million of venture capital in Israel in a model which basically guaranteed the downside. I think to the point, it's extent of 50% of foreign investors who came in and invested. That launched the whole thing. And mostly since then, they've stayed out of the way. There's some small initiatives, and the Army does an incredibly good job of training tech talent. And I think that combination is really the winner. It's private capital, stay out of the way, and the government, through the Defense Department or the defense industries, trains our best and brightest young kids on really advanced technologies. I joke, I got this investment in a group of 3 guys who are in the top PO program, who are working some wizardry with cell phones for medicine right now. And it's like, they're like 24 years old and they've run like $100 million weapons programs. That's pretty amazing.
So I'm having fun. I can continue doing this all day, but I want to bring the audience into this and have a chance to kind of pick your brains as well. So I'm going to kick it over to Yael, who I know has been fielding a few audience Q&As as well.
Can I just give a shout out to my old friend Dennis Wolf, who I see here? Good to see you, Dennis.
Yeah, I see Marty Geller on here too. Hey, Marty.
So this has been an incredibly fascinating conversation, and both to Bradley and to Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to really provide some insight on what's going on in the Israeli tech ecosystem and here in the United States. We've received several questions from a few people. The first question that I'm seeing currently in the chat box is from Dennis Wolf. He wrote, "How dependent are we on China, and what protections are we practicing to minimize negative impacts?"
Yeah,
who's we in that question?
Israel.
Oh, go ahead, Michael. I was about to do the U.S.
It's a really, really, really good question, and I've spent some time on this both with the government. I wrote a blog post about this probably, it feels like ages ago. I think it was close to 2 years ago. Why Israel needs a CFIUS program, and that this would be a big deal. And I know there are a bunch of organizations in Washington that I'm connected to who are looking at this topic. There's 2 parts to it. One is the government-to-government level, which relates to probably projects in the ports, et cetera. The other thing is private companies. So, Chinese companies have bought Israeli tech companies and created some pretty hardy R&D facilities, particularly in Ramat Gan. And, they pay top dollar like Amazon does here. And I think on the private sector, there's an awareness issue. And on the public sector, part of it, I believe, goes back to politics of the Obama era. And part of it is, Israel's kind of in this center of the world thing where, it's X hours to the U.S., which is its number 1 ally, but ain't that far from India and China either. And those are markets. And my personal view is this needs to be taken much more seriously. Not just my personal view, I wrote it. I think it was almost 2 years ago. Then got called in a bunch of government meetings. Not enough has happened in my view since then. And I think it's a real issue. And candidly, 99% of not just the Israeli entrepreneurs or companies, but I actually think Israeli politicians are just not aware of the seriousness of this issue. Maybe it's 95% on the political level and 99% on the entrepreneurship level.
Bradley, what's your take on this from the U.S. side?
Yeah, I just think that U.S. startups and U.S. tech companies in general are already somewhere between mystified and terrified of doing business in China, and it's just going to get even harder and worse right now. And by the way, we're seeing the beginnings of Trump starting to sort of blame the World Health Organization and China for the virus, whether he's right or wrong. By him doing so, and it clearly fits his pattern of political behavior, it'll only further exacerbate tensions. And so in the old days of an Uber busting into China and spending billions of dollars trying to break into the market, I think it's going to be a long time to see something like that again.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Steve Gersten, and this is another question really focused on China. Do you believe that the world will start to move away from China as a partner in trading? Michael, how about you first?
The world is a big place. It's a really big place. And, the Belt and Road Initiative is a big deal, number one. Number two, China has invested heavily over the last 20 years in sucking up the world's precious metal supply. Three, they've invested a ton of dough in courting countries in Africa, countries in South America with real economic issues. And you'll notice as COVID struck, they were the first ones to turn up in Italy. And so I think in tough economic times, people go where they think they're going to get help in cash and loyal partners. And so I think the time we're living in right now, where U.S. policy is unpredictable on the international front, and China has turned up both with infrastructure spending, the Belt and Road Initiative, and by buying precious metals and buying kind of key suppliers, and being the only one consuming oil at higher levels right now, and a bunch of other things. I actually don't see the world pivoting from China. I actually think I'll say it this way, Asia in general, and Asia should not be confused with China, it's a bigger place than that, is going to grow in importance over the coming 36 to 48 months. And I think China's not going anywhere.
Yeah, I agree.
What types of costs, this is a question from Alexander Aegis, what types of cost-cutting initiatives are favored by portfolio companies during these potentially cash-strapped times? What are your takes on both of that?
Sure. I mean, look, it depends on what stage they're at, but it's, at least for our earlier stage companies, people first and foremost, and obviously we don't want to see people get laid off any more than anyone else does, but there are times where you just have a workforce that now can't be supported by the revenue that's coming in. So that's, or the ability to raise money in the near future. So that's first and foremost. Second would be probably some level of outside expertise. So for example, through our platform, we help a lot of our portfolio companies with communications. Half of them have probably called us in the last couple of weeks saying, hey, can I fire my PR firm? I'd rather not be spending $15,000 a month or whatever it is right now. And our answer is, unless the PR firm is really killing it for them and that's producing real value immediately, yeah, go ahead and do that and call us if you have a problem and we'll help you. But look, and obviously the good news is the CAC has gone way down, but people are spending, a lot less on Facebook advertising and marketing as well. But the one thing that you can't really cut back on, I think, is engineering talent, because if you're not trying to develop the underlying technology in a way that is truly meaningful in what you set out to do, then it doesn't really matter whether you last an extra 12 months or not. You're not going to achieve anything.
So I agree with what Bradley said. I'll take a fine point to 2 points he attacked. One thing I'm seeing this time that I didn't see in any other cycle, and Alex, it's good to see you, is people are like putting the pause button on rent. And one of the things that I think work from home has taught people is, okay, what the hell, I get out of my office. First, I'll break the contract, then I'll deal with the consequences. I never saw that before this, but I think Zoom has taught people that I can jam the landlord. And that's going on in a big way. We are hearing and seeing that everywhere. That's number one. to put a fine tooth or a fine point to what Bradley said about people, which is the number one expense in every tech company, basically. There's two approaches to this always. One is, the RIF, reduction in force, you lay people off. And two is a salary cut. And we've seen our portfolio companies do both. Thankfully, it actually hasn't been that dramatic in total. But one of the other things I've noticed during this time is that the keep the jobs, cut the salaries approach seems to be working better this time, whereas in '08, the opposite was true in my view. There is something about this virus which is causing people to seek solidarity. Maybe it's the rise also that Bradley was talking about, religious attendance, which wasn't the case in the GFC. And I think this kind of, we're all in this together, let's all take some pain, has mattered. For what it's worth, I think one of the big problems we're up against right now is the fact that public sector employees and politicians have taken no pain, and everybody else is taking pain right now is a big, big, big deal in every democracy. And that, in my view, is going to have repercussions for many, many, many years.
Thank you, Michael. So this is a question that I got through email. Both of you spoke about how several companies, or many companies in that respect, have pivoted their efforts or adapted their efforts to meet the new needs and demands of people during the spread of COVID-19. Once our society hopefully resumes back to the sense of normalcy and we're no longer in the process of social distancing, do you think companies who have pivoted their efforts will continue to go back down their new shifted track, or will they resume back to their original focus pre-corona, like Nexar, for instance, which you had mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think, look, most of them will go back because ultimately the reason why we invest in these companies is we see the potential for exponential growth based on their original idea. There are cases like, for example, we have a client, not a portfolio company, that made medical garments that's now been converted to masks. They're selling really well. You could see a world where they're actually better off continuing to do that. But I think that that's a private equity-backed company, not a venture-backed startup. But I think for companies that have a really big idea and a really big TAM, and if you don't have those two things, you probably did not get money from Michael or me in the first place. The original idea is the thing we'd want you to focus on.
I don't know. I don't know.
So yeah, it's all up in the air. So we have a question from Cyril. Michael, I heard a story that you moved to Israel because your rabbi told you the best way to help Israel was to move there and create thousands of jobs. What's the true story?
Yeah, it wasn't that he told me, but yeah, actually, I'm not one of these guys who follows rabbis around the world. But he challenged me that if I really wanted to be a Zionist and help Israel, the best way would be to come and try to help the economy create 10,000 jobs. Those were his exact words, of people to earn an honest and decent living. I think, by the way, one of the things we're discovering right now as part of this COVID pandemic is we have a lack of employment resilience. I've spent a lot of time the last few weeks trying to build this plan for the economic recovery here. And one of the things we're building is an employment resilience index that starts at the family level. And we've brought together some of the smartest minds and technologists to actually build it. And I think one of the things, someone mentioned the sharing economy earlier, sometimes referred to as the gig economy. I don't think it's any of those, but I think one of the things we learned from it is people want to earn extra income, and they find income resilience by doing multiple jobs sometimes. And we need to figure out if we want to have interventions that matter, not just money sloshing around the system, enriching asset prices at the expense of workers. We need to find out what interventions work to create employment resilience and enable people to deal with the 21st century. And the fact that we can have unions that do collective bargaining agreements that include a salary and employment terms, but don't include how we enrich people's education on an ongoing basis is outrageous. The fact that our government has no idea, our governments collectively have no idea how to upskill workers in an effective way is a big, big, big problem. And we're living that right now. Ironically, one of the things I hear, for example, from Wix is that the entrepreneurs who are on their platform who are pretty digital are very resilient. And because they have entrepreneurial skills, but we got to teach that more. The current school system doesn't teach that. And so we really got to dig into that. I think that's one of the big lessons from this pandemic.
Thanks so much, Michael. So I want to make sure that we get everyone out on time at 2 p.m. But one quick question, would love to hear from both of you. What is the role of Israel's government in supporting Israeli high tech during the coronavirus pandemic? As our last question for the call.
Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I'm not sure I should answer this question because I've been alternatively feted and lambasted over the last week on this topic. But Eugene Kandel, who I love, who is the former chief economic advisor to the prime minister of One Startup Nation Central, and I did a podcast together as to whether there should be mass bailouts of startup tech companies by the Israeli government. I think the answer is no. He thought the answer is yes. And I'm of the opinion that if you're an investor and you're exposed to the company and you haven't raised the money, you ought to be wiped out by the next capital, and it should be raised at a market price. And if that happens to me, so be it. Shame on me. And that if there's any intervention by the government, it should be in three places. One is they ought to invest in more tech infrastructure. Infrastructure in tech is communications, and it's human upskilling. We need to invest in training more people to be software engineers. That's infrastructure. The second area is we need to somehow help people who may be laid off at the periphery of companies in the tech sector, but more broadly in the broader economy, where people who own their own businesses, whether retail shops or whatever, are really hurting right now, and figure out how we do help them with digital transformations or get themselves out of this. That's the second place, and then the third place is if we can enable new industries through programs like Yozma had 30 years ago, that's a good idea. So just as one silly example, tourism is still a pretty analog business, but if we can create kind of a both a health tourism and a digital tourism initiative that's based in Israel, that's a whole other industry we can create that crosses borders that people in Athens and Rome have as well, and bring a lot of people to work at that. So those are three areas I invest in. But this notion of bailing out venture capitalists, of which I'm one of them, to me is not just anathema to capitalism, it's ethically and morally wrong.